I never expected that my summer would turn out the way it did, but sometimes the most extraordinary adventures start in the most ordinary of places. My name is Daniel Carter, and I grew up in a quiet little town in Kansas where nothing much happened beyond the sound of cicadas in the evenings and the occasional tractor rolling down Main Street. My family lived on the edge of town, close enough to walk to the general store but far enough out that we had wide open fields and a big barn that always seemed to smell faintly of hay and sunshine. We didn't have many animals, just a few chickens, an old hound dog named Rusty, and one very stubborn donkey who ended up changing my entire life. The donkey's name was Benny. He wasn't much to look at, gray with shaggy hair that never seemed to smooth down no matter how much I brushed him, and big ears that twitched every time a fly buzzed nearby. He had the kind of eyes that looked both comical and wise, as though he knew far more than he let on but found it amusing to keep it to himself. Benny had been with us for as long as I could remember, a gift from my grandfather who believed that every farm, no matter how small, needed a dependable donkey. As a kid, I used to climb on his back and pretend I was a cowboy riding across the plains. As I got older, Benny mostly just grazed lazily in the pasture, only occasionally perking up if he heard the rattle of the grain bucket. That summer, though, everything shifted. It all started on a late June morning when the air was already heavy with heat, and the sky looked like it had been painted a hazy blue. My parents were talking about taking a trip down to visit my aunt in Texas. They said I was old enough to handle the place for a week by myself, but they wanted me to look after the animals carefully. I was thrilled at the idea of independence. At 17, staying home alone felt like freedom. What I didn't realize was that freedom often comes with responsibility and sometimes unexpected adventure. The first few days were uneventful. I fed the chickens, collected their eggs, made sure Rusty got his meals, and tossed hay to Benny. But on the third day, something odd happened. When I went out to the barn early that morning, I noticed that Benny was staring out past the fence, his ears pointing toward the horizon. Normally, he was too lazy to bother about much, but this time he seemed restless. He pawed the ground, brayed loudly, and wouldn't even touch his breakfast. It was so unusual that I decided to check it out. I followed his gaze and saw something glinting far off at the edge of our property, down by the creek. Curiosity tugged at me, and I figured there was no harm in investigating. I grabbed a rope, hitched it loosely to Benny's halter, and led him along with me. He resisted at first, as if trying to decide whether this little expedition was worth his effort, but after a few minutes he plodded along beside me. The grass was tall, brushing against my jeans, and dragonflies darted above the creek water. When we finally reached the spot, I saw what had caught Benny's attention, a small, weathered wooden box half buried in the mud, its lid slightly open as though the creek had recently washed it up. I bent down and pulled it free, my hands getting muddy. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of old papers and what looked like a leather journal. My heart gave a little leap. I loved history, and anything mysterious instantly sparked my imagination. Benny snorted beside me as if urging me to open it. I sat on the grass, brushed off the mud, and flipped through the journal. The handwriting was old-fashioned, scrawled in ink that had faded but was still readable. It told the story of a man named Thomas Whitaker, who had lived in our county more than 100 years ago. He wrote about traveling across Kansas with his donkey. Yes, a donkey, and hiding something of value near a landmark that sounded suspiciously like our farm. My pulse quickened as I realized this was no ordinary diary. It was a treasure map of sorts, though Thomas never spelled out exactly what he had hidden. He left clues scattered through the entries, little riddles that seemed meant for someone who knew the land. I couldn't believe my luck. Here I was, alone for a week, and I had stumbled on an adventure straight out of a storybook. The only question was, what should I do? I could call my parents or the sheriff, but something about the way Benny had led me here made me feel like this was meant for me. And maybe, just maybe, for Benny too. That night, I stayed up late in my room with the journal spread out on my desk, tracing the words by lamplight. The clues spoke of hidden trails, of old oak trees split by lightning, of a stone shaped like an arrowhead pointing toward the horizon. I recognized some of the places he described. They were on the outskirts of our property and beyond, places I'd wandered as a kid but never paid much attention to. The more I read, the more certain I became. I wasn't just going to read about this treasure. I was going to find it. The next morning, I saddled Benny with some makeshift packs. I loaded a few bottles of water, sandwiches, and the journal, and set off with him by my side. It felt strange at first, like I was playing some elaborate game, but soon the seriousness of it sank in. This wasn't just about chasing a legend. It was about testing myself, about stepping into a story that someone from the past had left behind. We followed the first clue, which led us to the old oak at the edge of the pasture. Sure enough, its trunk was split down the middle, blackened from a lightning strike years ago. The next clue took us further, through fields and across a narrow bridge into the woods. At times, I doubted myself, but Benny seemed to know when I was on the right path. He would tug on the rope, bray softly, or even stop and stare until I noticed something I had overlooked. It was almost as if he understood the journal better than I did. Days passed in this strange rhythm. By day, Benny and I trekked across the land, uncovering pieces of Thomas Whitaker's puzzle. By night, I camped near the creek or under the shelter of trees, reading more of the journal by flashlight while Benny grazed nearby. I started talking to him, as if he were another person. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was because he listened in that calm, steady way that only animals do. I told him about my dreams of leaving our small town someday, of studying history and archaeology, of finding meaning in forgotten stories. Benny would flick his ears, chew thoughtfully, and occasionally nudge me with his nose as though to say he understood. The final clue came after nearly a week of searching. The journal spoke of the stone that points to the rising sun, beneath which the earth holds the memory of my journey. It took me a while to figure out, but eventually I remembered a huge, jagged rock formation in the woods east of the creek that did, from a certain angle, look like an arrow pointing toward the sunrise. With my heart pounding, I led Benny there. We dug together. Well, I dug while Benny supervised, and after hours of sweat and determination, my shovel struck something solid. I unearthed a small iron-bound chest, rusted with age, but still intact. My hands shook as I pried it open. Inside, wrapped carefully in cloth, were old coins, a silver pocket watch, and letters that spoke of Whitaker's journey westward. It wasn't treasure in the sense of gold bars or riches,